Hey, how's it going? Before I get started with today's video, I just want to remind people who are on my Patreon that tomorrow, Sunday, is going to be another interactive live stream. That's where I go on live stream for 2 or 3 hours and I take your questions live on the broadcast. So for those Patreon subscribers, remember it'll be tomorrow. I'll post the announcement later today, this afternoon. And if you're not a member, please join, and I hope you enjoy it. So anyway, with that out of the way, there was this very interesting article in The Soccer. The Soccer is like this blog that just aggregates a whole bunch of very interesting posts from a lot of different interesting commentators. And one guy called David Sant took issue. Well, no, he didn't take issue with me, but he disagreed slightly insofar as what I think was going to happen insofar as the Ukraine conflict is concerned, and specifically the 101st Airborne Division of the Americans that is currently acclimating in Romania. Now, David Sant, he thought, he was in general agreement with my general points, right, that the Americans are just itching to get into this conflict, right? But he was of the opinion that what would happen, more likely to happen, would be for the 101st Airborne Division to be deployed to, what's the name of this damn town? I always forget the name of it. Let me just look it up real quick here. Tiraspol. Tiraspol is the capital of Transnistria, that little sliver on the east side of Moldova. Tiraspol, right, from Romania, it's a very short distance to Tiraspol. And David Sant was of the opinion that, no, the Americans wouldn't deploy to Odessa, but rather to Tiraspol, because that would be like the perfect staging ground to sort of like get the American forces ready for a big push by way of Romania. Romania and into Moldova, right, and into Transnistria. And from Transnistria, they'd fight the Russians, you know, basically in the direction of Odessa, perhaps try to capture Odessa before the Russians did, you know, something like that. And I think that David Sant's point was excellent, and I should have paid attention more to the map, because it didn't occur to me. It didn't, you know, I wasn't thinking. So anyway, go check out his post. It's in the description below. I think you'll really enjoy it. It's very interesting, and it gives a lot of food to chew on, as it were, insofar as this whole conflict is concerned. Now, today, what is it? Saturday, October 29th, we are getting news that in the early morning hours of today, local time, around 4:20 a.m., there was a number of drone attacks, both aerial and underwater drones, by the Zelensky regime forces against the Russian military installation at Sevastopol. That's where the Black Sea Fleet is stationed. And they really went at it. They sent like something like 9 airborne drones and something like 7 underwater drones. Now, what's also interesting is that it's emerging that an American forward reconnaissance drone was doing loops in the Black Sea, east to west, endless loops monitoring this attack. So clearly it was prepared by the Americans. And in fact, the Ministry of Defense of the Russians has come out this morning, and they're saying that the idea for this was carried out by the Brits, just as the idea of the Nord Stream bombing was done by the Brits. And in fact, they know who did it. And apparently, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, it's some Brits, obviously part of the British government, the British Armed Forces, who are currently in Nikolaev. Oh boy, if I were them, I'd find a newer location, man, because the Russians are going to hit you hard if they haven't already. But anyway, the point of bringing this attack up is, you know, you see how we're getting to a point where the Americans are just, they can't help themselves. They want to get so involved in a head-to-head conflict with the Russians that they are carrying out these attacks. And yeah, sure, it might have been the idea of the Brits, but the people who actually carried it out were the Americans. And so far as what kind of drones were used and that sort of thing, I, at this time, do not have the information for that. Apparently, the drones were all in all unsuccessful. although there was some fire, some oil fire, clearly something was hit in Sevastopol. The Russians are saying, oh, it was no big deal, no big deal. They tend to do that. They tend to minimize their own losses or casualties. They never tell a lie, the Russians, at least the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. What they will do is they will tell the truth or they will omit some information. And reading the printout from the Ministry of Defense, they neglected to mention if any of their big ships there had been hit or anything of that nature. But they said that just only like a couple of these drones had gotten through. How much actual damage was done remains to be seen. And I actually don't have a problem with them not revealing all of their losses. It would be irresponsible to give that kind of intelligence, just make it publicly available. So that I don't have a problem with. What I do have a problem with is outright lying, which is what the Zelensky regime invariably does. And now they're like making a to-do about this attack, and it's, and Crimea is about to fall practically. It's just absurd. A few drones isn't going to make a difference in this conflict, okay? Unless they're Iranian drones. So anyway, my point, and it's a very serious point. The Americans rather, they are so itching to go head-to-head with the Russians. They can't help themselves. And here's something else that's very interesting. It's been pointed out that the American military doctrine has been quietly changed. And now they ascribe to themselves the right to use nuclear weapons as a first strike option. Now, this is actually serious. See, the Russians, they're very clear about it. They will never use nuclear weapons except in two conditions. Number one, that as a retaliation for a previous nuclear strike. And number two, if the state of Russia itself directly is under threat. I mean, like armies on the doorstep of Moscow kind of thing, okay? Which is reasonable. It's a reasonable doctrine. And the Americans, for decades, following Ronald Reagan's famous dictum that no one can win a nuclear war, the Americans have always had the doctrine of retaliatory strikes only, that they would never initiate a first strike. But just now, they've changed, 75 years of doctrine. And nobody seems to be talking about it. Nobody seems to be noticing. Except, of course, the dissident people such as myself, and Zero Hedge had a big piece on it. That's how I learned about it, as a matter of fact. Now, the Americans, the American leadership class, they know the score insofar as here in Ukraine is concerned. Every offensive, day by day, that the Zelensky regime tries to carry out is weaker and weaker. And the Russians, they've announced that they've filled up their conscription numbers, and they also have an additional something like 60,000 volunteers. So they have 1/3 men who've joined up, and they've said that the call-up has ended, and they're going to process these people and get them into their positions. And it's pretty clear that the Russians, come late November into early December, when the ground has hardened here in Ukraine, they're going to make a big, big push. The issue is, are the Americans going to make a big, big push? Because they're itching to do that. And something else that's come up in Politico, of all places. Politico is reporting that some analysts have been saying that the American military is extremely weak, which isn't surprising. I mean, the mandates for that substance that people had to take, a lot of the best soldiers of the Americans quit over that mandate. And the soldiers that they have, and I've gotten some testimony. Actually, it was really interesting. In the Patreon last week, as a matter of fact, there was one American veteran who was on. And he was telling us about the conditions, the woke culture in the army. And that it was out of control. I mean, really, crazy. And that he had apparently MTF person who was their sergeant, and insane Caligula levels of insanity in the American army. And so if Politico is reporting that the American army is considered quote unquote weak, then, they're not up to the job, okay? And so I think that the American leadership class either, number one, doesn't understand how weak the American military is and is going to be sending these men to a slaughter, or number two, they know exactly how weak they are and they are counting on them being slaughtered so as to provide the motivation and the excuse to just ramp up all the way to 11 an American war against the Russians. I mean, the Americans, they don't know when to quit. And I see so many of these, so many veterans on YouTube who were in Iraq or Afghanistan. And they act so arrogant and they talk so dismissively of the Russians, that the Russians can't do anything, that the Russian army sucks, it's a stalemate, blah, blah. Okay, if it's a stalemate, riddle me this, Batman. Why is it that if it's a stalemate, the Americans have to go in? If it's a stalemate, then, it's just going to grind on, or eventually the Zelensky regime forces are going to take over, right? I mean, if the Russians are such crappy soldiers, it's just a matter of time, right? And these third of a million men who are going to be thrown in, they're going to be thrown into a meat grinder, right? So why should the Americans jump in? I mean, you can't have it both ways. You can't say that the Russian army is just total garbage, and at the same time, we got to go in to support the Zelensky regime. You can't have it both ways. So anyway, that's the propaganda spin of the narrative. That the Russians suck, and they suck so bad that the Americans have to go in to do the job. And from other data points, you're seeing that the Americans are just not up to the task. And this attack on Sevastopol in the Crimea, on the Russian fleet there, what's that? That's a provocation. That's just trying to up the ante. The 101st Airborne in Romania, David Sant is absolutely right. In Tiraspol, that would be the perfect target for them. And by the way, I looked at Google Maps, and the distance from Tiraspol to Odessa by the highway is 104 kilometers. So it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, David Sant, hats off to you. I think that your idea is much better insofar as an American deployment in this situation. Because going from Romania, crossing Moldova, and Moldova is a small country, and of course they're on the side of the good guys, the good guys who support neo-Nazi, psychopaths in Kiev, which is what they are. Yeah, the good guys, could cross easily Moldova. I mean, just drive through it and attack Tiraspol and potentially take it, even though there is a Russian army garrison. And that's important because there is a Russian army garrison, some peacekeepers there. And the Russians wouldn't have much trouble reinforcing that with an airborne battalion of their own, or perhaps larger, who knows. So the point is, it could be that Transnistria, this little sliver that's been very much on the periphery of this whole conflict from the very get-go, it could be where the American army meets up with the Russian army in direct head-to-head combat. And the Americans are going to lose. They're going to lose. And they are. Because they have a weak military. Their best soldiers have left. They what was it? 70% of their soldiers are obese? They don't have the men to do it. And, these resignations that happen because of the substance, because of the mandate over the substance, those are top-tier men. Those are the NCOs who've been around since forever. Those are the sergeants, the guys who know how to run an army. They're gone. The Americans, man, they just don't know when to quit. And they're supporting the good guys who are just scum of the earth. And by the way, have you heard that the Americans are trying to get some ISIS fighters to fight on the side of the Zelensky regime? Oh yeah, they're bringing the psychopaths from other places that they finance. They're bringing them over to Ukraine, apparently, or at least that's the plan. Mm. You know, this whole thing. Let's just hope that the Russians in November and December finish this off quick enough that the Americans just say, "Okay, Uncle, okay, we're just going to wash our hands of it." You know, yesterday I had a conversation with, or rather on Thursday, I had a conversation with Garland Nixon. Great guy. It's on the Roundtable channel, of course. And I had this conversation with him, and he was pointing out, that this is what the Americans always do. When they support you, and then when they realize it's a lost cause, they just like, oh, gotta go, I gotta do, bye. And they just walk away. So let's hope that the Americans do this in this conflict. Because the longer it goes on, it's only going to be a needless loss of life and the needless destruction of Ukraine. But the Americans, man, I mean, had it been just the Zelensky regime forces against the Russians, this would have been over months ago. It would have been over probably in late summer. Because the word is too that, see, the Russians, they hear a lot of chatter in foreign languages, in Polish, in Romanian, in English, sometimes French. I mean, like, it looks like all the new gear that they've shipped in, it's being operated by foreigners, foreign contractors who, of course, were like 5 minutes ago, were part of NATO, of some NATO army, of some nation of NATO, and they resigned and signed up to be a private military contractor and went off here to Ukraine to operate this gear that they've sent. Because, of course, this gear takes months to train on it. You can't have the Ukrainian soldiers doing it, not because they're not capable, but they don't have the time. They don't have 6 to 9 months to train on this gear, right? And so it looks like the Zelensky regime forces are just running out. They're just running out of men. And were it not for the false hope that NATO has been giving them, the Zelensky regime forces, the armed forces of Ukraine, would have given up months ago and would have saved countless lives. It's reputably estimated at this time that something like 125,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed in action, and an additional 175,000 are wounded, incapacitated. That's 300,000 men that are gone, okay? 300,000 men for nothing. I'm just hoping that this all ends quickly. But anyway, I thought that you should know what's been going on. Yeah, the Americans want to get in. Oh boy.